Thank you guys for having me, and it's always hard to follow a dare, even if it's just an introduction. I very seldom meet someone that has as much energy as I do, and when I meet somebody that exceeds my energy, it actually frightens me a little bit. But I do want to thank Adair for having me here and for everything she's done for the Tom Lee Institute. In 1983, Larry McMurtry wrote an article called Ever a Bridegroom, which took Texas to task and Texas literature and letters to task, and what he basically said in this article was that Tom Lee would best be remembered for his art rather than his literature. Adair personifies that, what she's done with his art, but what I like is the way she's moving into the literature section as well, and brought folks on like myself, like Daniel, like Mimi Gladstein, that are really trying to bring Tom's work, literature works, out to the rest of the folks that only know Tom through his art. I also like to thank the El Paso Art Museum for allowing us to use their venue tonight and for hosting this. So discuss the genesis a little bit about this project sorry, I know some folks don't like microphones, I'm one of those. Discuss the genesis of this project. I'm actually working on a documentary right now with Stephen Davis at the Whitliff Collections on John Graves and John Graves' works. As I was down there doing some research with Steve is actually the series editor of the book where this book will come out from, the Southwest Writers series through UT Press. And Steve, as the curator at Whitliff Collections, that's where I actually found the manuscript of Hart Stillwell, Glory of the Silver King, which is out on Texas A&M Press right now. I edited that, got it together, got it to print, and it's been on the shelves for about 6 months now. Steve is the guy that oversaw those collections and worked with me as I edited it and made sure we had all the permissions and everything that we needed. So as I was there working on the John Graves documentary and doing some research and digging through some stuff in there, Steve asked me if I'd be interested in doing Tom Lee and J. Frank Dobie's letters and editing for UT Press. Well, I can't say exactly what I said when he asked me, but it was basically a heck yeah with a little more stronger expletive to start that off. And it's interesting that I was doing this in my first semester as a PhD candidate at Texas Tech University. And on my application letter, before I'd met Jim, before I'd met Adair, before I'd even gotten involved with the Lee Dobie project, one of the things that I wrote in my application process was I wanted to write Tom Lee's definitive biography and make sure that people didn't say, well, who is J. Frank Dobie? And literally within 3 months of writing that letter, working on another project, guess what falls into my lap? So the phone call, once Steve did this, Steve said I need to check with Allison Faust. Allison's going to be the lady that's the editor at UT Press that will handle this project. He called her and said, well, we need to talk to Jim. And I called Jim, and I actually can't remember if I called Jim or Adair first. I think it might have been Adair that I spoke to first. And then spoke to Jim. I emailed Jim, and literally he must have been sitting there waiting for my email. 10 minutes later, he responded to me and told me to call him. And I called, and it's one of those few relationships that when you first talk to someone on the phone, that there was an instant kindred spirits between Jim and myself. And as Jim and I started to talk, the conversation actually got off of Tom Lee and J. Frank Dobie and went on to all the books that we've read. And Jim, I hear, has some close friends in the audience tonight, and Tom's house as well. If you ever walk in, there's no such thing as wall space there. It's either covered with art, or there's books and bookshelves, or literally stacked on the floor up the wall as far as you can. And I think Tom had a great saying that something about space, that he doesn't have too many books, he just has a lack of space. That's a Tom or a Jim kind of Jimism there. So as I spoke to Jim, Jim was like, why don't you come down for the weekend, let's hang out and talk, go over these letters and look at them. So it's, it's one of those surreal moments in your life. I knock on the door, Jim answers the door, invites me in, I walk in, and I'd heard Tom was not a very tall man, and this was before I knew Jim was adopted, but Jim opens the door, and Jim's about 6'4", and kind of, yeah, that's tall, Parker. I bring my cheering fan with me here everywhere I go. So Jim opens the door, invites me in. As I walk in, the first thing you're struck with when you walk into Jim's house is there's Sarah in the summertime staring at you. one of the most, one of Tom's most iconic works. And it's just a beautiful picture. And then as you walk into his living room, you have all these Mesa Verde pots, and then the sinking of the wasp is on the wall. So you feel like you're walking into a museum. And then Jim was like, after sharing a caffeine-free diet root beer, asked me if I'd like to see the letters. And it was kind of one of those Henry James aspirin papers moments where he's like, would you like to see the letters? And I walk in, and he has this long, minimalist, table in his living room, in his dining room, and the letters are there. And it's kind of one of those moments that if I was a film director at the time, I would have panned out on myself, because it was kind of like Jim disappeared, Sarah in the Summertime disappeared, and all of a sudden it was just these letters. And when you get to the letters, the stack of letters is about like this. It's actually quite amazing. So as Jim and I talked and I started reading the letters, I think Jim at that point had already decided Brandon was the guy to edit the letters. We talked about it over the weekend. I think we called a dare over the weekend and decided that this is the direction we were going to go. And this whole this time frame that we're talking about here, from the time I talked to Steve to the time I spent the weekend with Jim, was 4 days. So it was a very quick turnaround and very surreal moment for me. So what are the letters, and what exactly are we looking at? There's 796 letters between Tom and Frank. And in these 796 letters, there's 618,000 words. They cover a time frame from 1938 to 1964. Frank actually entered the Lee family in 1936 when he was writing Tongues of Monty, and he was doing research for Yaqui Gold and Apache Silver. In Yaqui Silver, he actually contacted Tom Lee Sr. first, because Tom Lee Sr. would take little trips into Mexico and other places to find mines. And that's how the family originally met Frank Dobie. And this all was occurring when Tom was actually in Chicago studying with John Norton, and when he and Nancy Lee were living in Santa Fe on Fremont Ellis's place, and living the bohemian lifestyle, trying to become artists themselves. And after Nancy passed away in 1936, Tom Jr. moves home to live with Dad, and as he's there, that's when Frank is introduced to Tom, and they start to begin this long 796 letter correspondence with each other. What makes this project interesting, and is where I feel so blessed to be a part of this, is all of Frank's letters are open for viewing at HRC. You just have to go in and ask to see his letters, and they're actually very antiquated. They're all card cataloged. It's not a digitalized collection. You have to dig through card catalog to find a letter, go read it. And people have always wondered some questions about Tom and Frank's relationship. How close were they? Because everybody knew they were extremely close, but they didn't know the depth of the relationship. And the reason why was Tom kept all the letters from Frank to him, and all of his letters to Frank. So a lot of that was never shown and never seen, because all the letters were held privately. So as this project went on, and the correspondence goes on, in the 50s and 54, Frank had a hard spat with pneumonia. He almost passed away. He was hospitalized for about 6 weeks. So in 1954, they began to discuss, where should these letters go? And in 1939 and 1946, and then a little later in 1952, with Maud Sullivan at the El Paso Library, they donated a bulk of letters. Some of them are still there, some we don't know exactly where they are, we're still trying to find them. The rest were held by Tom and wanted to keep them private. But they wanted to know what they were going to do with these letters, because in 1954, after Frank got sick, he really started to realize, our correspondence is important. He had a much heavier correspondence with Tom than he ever had with Walter Prescott Webb and Roy Bedichek, which were the other two of the Texas Triumvirate, which Dobie was kind of the head of. And the reason they don't have correspondence, they all lived in Austin, they didn't have a traded paper trail between them. But Tom offers this way out in El Paso, this insight into 1940s, 1950s Texas writing that a lot of people lose and don't see, because these letters were held in private. So they were talking about what they were going to do. So in 1957, they decide, we're going to donate all of our papers to El Paso Public Library. Well, something happened in 1956 with the publication of the King Ranch history. They had a falling out. So Tom held on to these letters, and this is why these letters never went anywhere and were held privately by the family. So as Dobie and Lee are trying to discuss where they think letters should go, they start to even discuss, should we put this in a book? Well, they talk back and forth, and they decide Tom is the actual person that ends up making the decision. Tom says, these letters will never be seen until I'm dead and deep buried under the Texas red dirt, Texas soil. So they stopped. But in 1962, Bill Whitliff, which Whitliff Collections in San Marcos, started to talk about wanting to do this project. He wanted to edit the letters between Tom Lee and J. Frank Dobie. Now, Bill has been sort of a mentor to me, and it was interesting as I was reading these letters, he didn't even remember wanting to do the project. He did want to work with something with Tom and Frank, but didn't know exactly what it was. And Tom and Frank, it's kind of interesting. I sent these letters to Bill, and he kind of responds back to me, the follies of youth. Basically, Frank writes a letter to Tom saying, watch out for this kid. He's muy ambicioso. He was very ambitious. And I'm sorry I slaughtered my Spanish. That's the South Texas drawl. But he wanted to do these letters, and Frank was a little nervous about having Bill do them because he thought they were still too ripe. There were still things that needed to be written. And then as I'm reading these letters, Tom is saying that, and this is kind of interesting, this is kind of the aspirin papers moment as I read these letters, that Tom starts to say, well, we're going to need a PhD candidate, or a PhD person that knows how to research and can read these letters and knows the art of omission, to take out things that they necessarily don't want people to see. And Frank, interestingly enough, as someone that made his career and his living off of other people's works and other people's words, basically disparaged me as a writer, saying, well, he calls himself a PhD writer, and all this stuff's in writing, it will be in the book in the introduction. But Frank really didn't want to see this project go on at the time unless somebody could go in and selectively do it. So if you see the corpus of 618,000 words, 796 letters, and these two guys discussing the art of omission. Allison Faust, the editor at UT Press, wants me to conflate these 618,000 words, 796 letters, down to 100 to 120,000 words with annotations, introduction, forward, and all the fun stuff to explain what this is. So I don't think Frank and Tom really have to worry about the art of omission because there's going to be a lot omitted, but I think some of the stuff like the King Ranch stuff that they didn't want people to see, well, that's going to be in there. Now this picture is interesting, and I wanted to show this one. This picture's never seen the light of day. This was taken by Jim in 1961 at the Paisano Ranch, and this is one of the only casual pictures I've ever seen of Tom. This is obviously Tom on the left with the ever-present cigarette, and Frank on the right. This is one of the only pictures that you see them casual, and this was their Paisano weekend. They tried to get together every year. And in 1961, this is when they had just started to try to recoalesce their relationship after the fallout that they had over the King Ranch. So, as I'm putting this project together and I start to think about it, who is J. Frank Dobie? This is the hardest part about this letter. In going through the art of omission, I need to find out who these gentlemen are. And for lack of a better way to get into their minds. And Frank is interesting in the fact that in 1890, the U.S. Census Bureau said that the frontier was closed. Transcontinental Railroad was through. There was no frontier left. Frederick Jackson Turner wrote his famous frontier thesis that talks about this. This happens in 1890. J. Frank Dobie is born in 1888. Now this is interesting to think with this. Frank has always been accused of stealing other people's stories. Well, the frontier was closed at this point. Turner tells us, the Census Bureau tells us, and if you look at the maps at the time, the frontier, there was no more lands to conquer. Manifest Destiny had conquered those lands. Frank was born at a very opportunistic time. He had the time and the space to begin catching these stories. And over the years with revisionist history and stuff like that, it's become problematic because a lot of people have said, you know, Frank stole the stories of the Mexicans and stole the stories of the indigenous peoples and the Indians and made his career off of it. And everybody always thought Frank did that, you know, just completely vigilante style, just going out and getting it. Interestingly enough, when I was working on the Hart Stillwell project, I was reading the letters between Hart Stillwell and J. Frank Dobie because they were contemporaries. Frank Dobie actually has a passage in a letter to Hart Stillwell. Hart Stillwell wrote a book in 1942 called Hunting and Fishing in Mexico. And basically what he did was he introduced the American sportsman to hunting and fishing in Mexico. And Hart was a hardcore liberal from Brownsville. And as he's writing to Frank, he is talking to Frank about, I feel bad for what I'm doing to these people. I'm bringing in the Nordic herd to the south, and what is going to happen to their populations, we can only tell. And Frank responds to him, I sometimes feel the same way about my stories. I don't like taking these stories without having them in the authentic voice. And this is a very telling and very opening part of Frank. This is older in his life. This is in 1955, right before he gets sick, that he's really starting to think about his life and his career and what he's done. And he said he would want to do some other things. But you also have to consider Frank in the milieu as well, as in 1932, he appointed Jovita Gonzalez, a Mexican-American female, the first Mexican-American female head of the Texas Folklore Society. He opened that up. J. Mason Brewer, the first black historian and folklorist in 1941. Frank did all this. Frank would scream and yell and threaten God knows how many times to retire or to leave University of Texas because they were trying to keep blacks out of University of Texas. And Frank believed that if you're giving education, education is for everyone. So that kind of changes the image that we have of Frank a little bit. And you get a lot of this in the Lee Dobie letters. They talk about this, and they have very frank conversations, to pardon the pun there, but they have very open conversations about all these incidents. And one of the great ones during the Homer Rainey scandal, when Homer Rainey, the president of UT, was fired because he was protecting professors that put John Dos Passos' USA Trilogy on the English department's reading list. That's what ended up having Frank actually leave UT for good. And this led into tenure issues that we're going through now. And the times from 1940s and 1950s that were in the headlines then with academia and with education are the same conversations we have now. So Frank was actually forward thinking at that time, and we could actually use him. He screamed and yelled about tenure, that we need tenure for professors so they have the freedom to go in and teach stuff like John Dos Passos and not worry about getting fired. So Frank is a little more liberal than people would think, and he was actually more forward thinking in the fact that a lot of people, his signature class was Life and Literature of the Southwest, which is still taught there. And with that, he gained the name Mr. Southwest. And people have always thought of Frank as simply a regionalist when he wasn't. Frank was one of the original proto-globalists. He was actually believing that it took the whole world to highlight the strengths and beauty of the region. And that's a part of Frank that we don't ever see because people have demonized him as stealing stories and doing this, when he was actually a lot more open than that. So as I start to learn Frank and get into that and start to understand him through the letters and then it's just also other readings of him, it kind of moves me on to think of, who is Tom Lee? First and foremost, and it's the first one on there, he's an El Pasoan, right? El Pasoan, am I right? Okay. El Pasoite. He is an El Pasoan first. He loves this city, came back to this city, and always ran back to it. And it's interesting that Nancy Lee, his first wife, in the journals of Nancy Lee, that was actually the first project between Carl and Tom that they printed. Nancy Lee basically said that Tom would never understand his Southwest until he climbed up onto the top of a tree and looked down on it and got perspective on it. Well, I'm from South Texas. I realize there's not many trees there. We have pretty much the same landscape. Y'all don't have many trees here. I think Frank would say, or Tom would say, he climbed up on Mount Franklin and got his perspective of the Southwest by looking at Mount Franklin. He lived at the foot of it. I've slept in his bed and woke up and looked at that beautiful mountain and understand the ties that Tom had to this area. So First and foremost, he was an El Pasoan. And then he was an artist he studied with John Norton at the Chicago Institute of Art. And it was interesting, I can't remember if it was in Daniel's talk today or if it was actually in Mimi's that they were talking about, I think they both kind of talked about this, but I think it was more Mimi that was talking about it was hard for Tom to make this transition from an artist, which is on the superficial, the outside, when you're painting the image of the person, and it's hard to go from that to a novelist where you're looking at the internal dialogue that's going on with the characters. But what's interesting, I wanted to raise my hand in her thing, and you wouldn't have probably got this without reading the letters. John Norton, and if you ever really study Tom's works, get close and just look at them, you can see the musculature, you can see the angles of the limbs are very true. John Norton actually taught his students to paint from the inside out. He would actually paint the skeletons, the muscles, then the tissues of the body, and that would build it. So that actually opened up some of that internal. I sometimes argue that, Tom was an internal painter rather than a superficial painter, and you can get this when you look at his characters. And there's an interesting painting that you really get this from, The Shining Plane, that has a man riding across from right to left, riding across high grama grasses, and he's on a horse. And one of the things Frank says to him is, that painting's all wrong. You can't paint this painting and sell it. This painting is just, it doesn't work. The horse would be skinny, the man's head would be down, because the man in Shining Plains depicted straight back, looking forward, his gaze is ahead. And Tom says in his return letter, no, Frank, you're wrong. The Shining Plains is all about hope. This guy's just starting out on his journey. And that's him looking at the internal fortitude of this rider as he's riding out on the plain, looking at this hope. And that's what you really see in all of Tom's work, is hope. Even the brave bulls dealing with death in the afternoon, dealing with the wonderful country, dealing with the hands of Cantu, a gentleman dying in the primal yoke. There's an underlying theme of hope in all of Tom's works. And that really started to get me to understand who Tom was as I read and looked at it that way. But then you also, his war correspondence years are really what began to form Tom Lee and who Tom was. He had a lot of loss early in his life. He met Nancy. They moved to Santa Fe. Nancy has an acute appendicitis attack, has it operated on, and 18 months later she's dead. And this was at the time, before he met Sarah obviously, was the love of his life. He came home 8 months after coming home from losing the woman that he loved the most. His mom passes away. He had a lot of loss in his life, so in 1938 he was living there with his dad. He was living with his dad, Tom Sr., and Tom Sr.'s new wife. And as he was there, his dad was trying to get him back into life, reinstitute him into life and get him moving. And it was that hope that I think Tom really grasped onto and really started to move forward. And as he was a war correspondent, you see in his works, with his two most famous paintings, you can't say that Tom Lee is not an internal painter after looking at the 2,000-yard stare. The 2,000-yard stare is the most iconic picture from World War II. And unfortunately, when I have to talk to my lay friends that are outside of the art world, the second I say the 2,000-yard stare, oh yeah, I know who Tom Lee is. And then you say the price, and the price, what's interesting about the price, that's the one with the soldier with the dangling arm and the blood, that was the first depiction of blood in Time Life magazine during World War II. And we'll see that picture in a little bit later because it was one that Tom was very proud of. And then we obviously all know Tom is an author. So learning who these guys are, these are their most popular collaborations. Okay, I've kind of figured out who these two guys are a little bit as individuals, but these are what they've collaborated on. The first one was Apache Gold and Yaqui Silver in 1939. That came from the meeting in Tom Lee Sr.'s office that, you need to get my son working for you. And Tom actually took Frank down to Pass to the North, and they looked at it, and Frank looked at some of Tom's sketches, and Tom did a quick little sketch of Frank right there. And it was literally kind of one of those moments like I had with Jim, here you go, here's the project. So all of a sudden, Tom is going in and illustrating Apache Gold and Yaqui Silver in 1939. And the Longhorns were in 1941. And what makes this interesting was this is where we actually, 1941, 1939 and 1940, Tom and Frank make 2 trips all over Texas up to Oklahoma. So Tom can see exactly what a longhorn looks like. And we're not talking about cattle, we're talking about Texas longhorn that runs like a deer and has the 8-foot wingspan on their horns. So as they do this, this is actually even a cathartic moment for Tom, not just in the sense that he's now doing his second major book, he also does his first commercialized writing project. He writes Randall. Some folks call it Rendado, some people call it Randall, but it's a famed ranch in South Texas that's 10 miles from where I grew up. And I grew up in this area. And what Tom writes about that, it's kind of interesting because it's prose and verse and images. It's kind of one of your first postmodernist images that you have going on here. And Tom really starts to think, wow, I've kind of got this writing bug going on. So then in 1950, that's the next collaboration where they do the Ben Lilly book over there on the right-hand side. And that's actually one of my favorite paintings by Tom. I absolutely love that. The beard pointing forward, the dog looking forward. But if I'm not mistaken, and Adair can help me with this, the painting is actually Ben Lilly flipped the other direction, and he's looking in this way, he would be looking west rather than east. But Little Brown wanted to change it that way because it worked with the way book flaps open. So, interesting there. And then John C. Duvall as well. That was the last project that they worked on, and the John C. Duvall was in, actually this was in 1939, this was actually the second one. The Ben Lilly legend was the last one that they worked on, that they collaborated on as partners, as Tom the illustrator and Frank the painter. So, knowing what they've collaborated on, knowing who the men are, now this is an interesting one. I had to really start to break down as I looked at these letters to get more into the psychoanalytical part of these folks than just what we've seen from what they've done in their lives and their resumes. So we start with the not-so-dapper Dobie. Dobie was known to walk around UT campus in a white suit with his pants tucked into his cowboy boots. He always wore cowboy boots. Always wore, except for in here, this picture on the right with Walter Prescott Webb's later in his life when he had gout and he could no longer wear cowboy boots. But he was always, and both of these pictures were taken by famed WPA photographer Russell Lee. Frank always had ubiquitous cigar in his mouth, usually had on a cowboy hat, was always kind of sloppy though, kind of just not dressed well, and his students always said that he would come in smelling like sweat and tobacco, which, you know, you look at Dobie's grizzled look and you kind of think that. So looking at appearances, I start to put some stuff together about these two, you know, how do they do this? And then you look at Tom, the ladies' man Lee, he's always very dapper. I mean, he's always dressed up, he's always to the T, even as older in his life. Jim said every morning he would wake up and comb his hair, brush his teeth, and make sure that he had on fresh clothes. One of the things that, and I always found this kind of persnickety, was he always made sure that his weight line, which is the button line on your shirt and your pants, matches. Jim said to the day his dad died, he made sure that that weight line matched. And you know, you look at the picture of him over here, this is the price that he's standing in front of right there. This picture of Tom was one of the pictures that he gave to Nancy Lee in Chicago, and then the other picture is just Tom later. So you have Dobie, when you juxtapose the two, you have Dobie, this real just blog, just throw it on, get it done, go out, and then you had a debonair guy, and it's actually very interesting that two of the most beautiful women I've ever seen in my life, three, obviously my wife's the most beautiful, but two of the most beautiful women I've ever seen in my life were Nancy Lee, Tom's first wife, and Sarah Lee, are just both beautiful women. And it's actually interesting that Nancy was a fairly acclaimed model in Chicago when Tom met her. So you kind of see the style and look really plays into Tom's work. And when you read Tom's work, just in his novels as well, you see that. The Brave Bulls, writing-wise, and I know there's a few writers in the audience, is one of the tightest novels I've ever read. Every word hinges on the next word, and it's a very tight, very concise story. So then, looking at their appearances, I move to the next one and look at their handwriting. This is Tom's handwriting, and this is actually what I would call sloppy Tom handwriting. And what's interesting is he's writing in this script in calligraphy, and look how the letters are all nice and straight. Very few people would ever know, looking at that, unless you looked at small little circumstances like that Tom was a lefty. And you know, most of the time lefties have that real big slant in their writing. But then you get Frank. And please don't think that as a presentation I was trying to find the prettiest Tom Lee letter and the ugliest Frank Dobie letter. This is actually a very neat letter for Frank. Most of his stuff has scratch outs like that, and it's not even just handwriting that he does this. Frank actually even does this on all of his typed letters as well. On all of his typescript letters, there's scratch out, handwrites, PSs, margins, and it's all over the place. So as I start to look at this, it kind of gives me, you know, you kind of look at, when you get into handwriting analysis, you start to look to see at the character. You know, you can tell Tom took his time. Tom really thought about this. Tom would usually have 2 or 3 letters drafted before he would write the final draft. And then you have Frank that was obviously, you know, going for the Kerouacian first draft, best draft. Let's get this on paper, get it out, and get it done. So it really started to show me a little bit about their writing styles. So as I start to think about their writing styles really play into this as well. Frank was known for turning out a book in less than 4 weeks. What he would do is he would go to Paisano, or he would go to a hunting camp in Live Oak County, or go somewhere in Eagle Pass with the idea to write, and he would go in, write the book, leave, get it finished. And it was all done just one sitting. He would write 12 to 14 hours a day until the book was finished. And then what was interesting with Tom's writing style is I start to look in these letters and look at them and learn a little bit of Tom through his work journals and just through letters that he writes back and forth to his publishers and editors. For the Wonderful Country, and actually for the Hands of Cantu is the best example. Hands of Cantu, the novel, is only 76,000 words, okay? Before he even writes the novel, he has a 45,000 word biography of Cantu, the main character, that never makes it into the novel. And what Tom would do was draw and draft out the full-size body of the characters and put them up in his studio. And Jim said, from 8:30 in the morning until noon, you didn't touch that studio door. Tom would come out from 12 to 1:30, have lunch, sit down with Sarah, talk with everyone, have fun. 1:30, that door of the studio closes again, and nobody goes in there until 5:30 or 6 when Tom comes out. And what's interesting about it was he would draw the characters in full relief, full size, and hang them up as he's writing, and he always wrote standing up. And all I can imagine is looking at Frank, you know, I've seen pictures of him writing, and he's over his keyboard hunched, just pounding away. And all I can picture of Tom when he's writing, and just from what I've understood from his letters and from his journals and stuff, is Tom in this studio with everybody locked out with his characters, having full-on conversations with these characters as he writes. And as you read his works, it really brings the characters alive when you look at it that way and imagine it that way, because that's how he did it. So it made their writing styles very different. The Hands of Cantu, such a short novel, took him 3 years. The Wonderful Country took him just a little over 2 years. The Brave Bulls was one of those, as Mimi was talking about today, started as a 7,000 word article for Life magazine that turned into a full-blown novel. That one he did in 14 months. And it was really interesting that the relationship that he had with Sarah, he wouldn't let anyone else see his reading, he wouldn't let anyone else in his studio, but every night when he finished a chapter, he'd bring it into Sarah and let Sarah read it and get Sarah's input on it. But as Jim always said, she would give input, but Tom wouldn't take what she said. She would give his input and he would just go back into the office and go back and do what he was doing. So their writing styles is who the men were and what they were doing was very interesting as far as exhibiting how different these men are. and how this art of omission that I have to follow through with and find on these letters, how am I going to do that? And I've done it by looking at this, because if you're looking at the art of omission and just the fastidiousness of the characters, Tom, there's not much art of omission in there, because Tom doesn't say stuff he doesn't mean. He's not off the cuff. He thinks everything through. Where Frank, you can even see with his writing, Frank doesn't think everything through. He just blurts it out and says it. And that's a lot of what hurt their relationship later on in their life, and it's a lot of what hurt Frank's relationships with a lot of folks. So now that we're talking about relationships, what was the relationship between Tom and Frank? Now, it's interesting because I'm coming on, hindsight's 20/20. You can always look back retroactively on something and see the relationship a lot better than people did that were closer to it. Lon Tinkle, in his first biography of Frank, talks about 8 pages about Tom and Frank's relationship. A little bit. It's Mr. Dobie this, it's Mr. Dobie that. Then in 1939, Tom changes. He stops saying that. And it kind of starts to move into well, I'm not quite your equal, but you're not really my father. And it's interesting to say that, and I think it's kind of wrong for Lon Tinkle to say that it was a paternalistic relationship, because working on Tom's biography, Jim has given me all the family letters. And really from 1924 until Tom Sr. passes away, there's a letter to Tom every day that Tom is not in El Paso. The relationship between the Tom Sr. and Tom Jr. is one of the strongest father-son relationships I've ever seen. So being a father myself and being a son myself, it's hard to say that someone else would come in and take that paternalistic torch away from Tom Sr. So I really think Lon was wrong in that, and just from reading the correspondence between these guys as they start to move on. Steve Davis kind of picks up on Frank's biography, kind of takes that same Lon Tinkle thing. And you really, in a way, can't blame these guys, because they don't have Tom's letters to read as they're writing this. They're only taking the letters that they see of Frank's side. And Don Graham as well writes a little bit about the relationship and those guys in some of his reviews, and kind of takes on the torch that's a paternalistic relationship, but it's not. And the relationship really has 3 distinct phases. And the distinct phases are from 1938 to 1941. And it's interesting, in 1941, Tom is on a cruise, because he's taken on his war correspondent duties with Time Life, and he's traveling around the North Sea, and he is actually out on patrol in 1941 when Pearl Harbor is bombed on December 7th. He doesn't get back to port until December 13th. He gets back to the 13th, and they ship him back to El Paso as quick as he can after he goes through with all the sensors and all this. And as soon as he gets back on January 4th, he writes a letter to Frank Dobie, and I'm going to read this, because this is where this is where Tom becomes a man in full. You see it. And what he writes in this letter is what you see, the ongoing themes that are in his work as well. And he writes to Frank, "It's a great and beautiful thing to be home. I got here just in time to spend Christmas with my family. It was a Christmas of real joy and thanksgiving for me. Yet in the midst of it, I could not forget my newfound comrades in the North Sea, and I felt like a deserter." That I'm working on this project, and I read this a couple days before I went and spent a weekend with John Graves. And for most of you folks that don't know this, John Graves lost his right eye. John Graves is the author of Goodbye to a River, by the way. Lost his right eye at the Battle of Saipan when a grenade went off. John and Tom had a very short but very close relationship in the late 50s and early 60s, and they have quite a bit of correspondence between the two. And as I was hanging out on Hardscrabble with John, I asked him, did you and Tom ever talk about, and I'm a war veteran myself, so you can you usually get these stories out of these old guys. And as I started to talk to John about it, I was like, did you and Tom ever talk about y'all's experiences in World War II in the Pacific Rim? And for you folks that have met John or talked to John or see John speak, he speaks just like he writes, very slow, very thoughtful, very poignantly. And he has one of those just mountainous foreheads that when he thinks, his whole forehead shrivels in, and you can see the wheels turning. And he stopped and he kind of looked at me, and he kind of has one of those affectations that he covers his right eye when he's talking to you. And he covers his right eye and he looks at me and he goes, "Tom never had to tell me anything. It's all in his books." And it's when he said that, you know, you take someone that went through that same World War II battleground and take another World War II vet, and they can see it, and it really validated what I felt about Tom's writing. And you start to get that through the letters, and that's one of the things that as I do this book in my introduction, I'm going to have to make sure that's understood. But it's interesting, and John always said that Tom was his favorite writer, which is a huge compliment coming from John Graves, especially in Texas Letters. And then when you also look at John wrote the introduction to the last edition of The Brave Bulls, and there's also a letter too that John says he reads The Wonderful Country every year, and I asked him if this was still true, and he said yes, he's read it about 25 times, that he reads this letter, he reads this book over and over, and it's the best Western that he's ever read. And it's there, if you understand the concept of what the Western book is, they're all there, and it is interesting because some of the identity crises that you read in the book, but also the porousness of the border and the porousness of identity that we see. And I think that's very important, that what you get from these letters is you start to see this, and especially in the letter that I just read, that was what really changed and what made Tom's life what it was. And also what he saw, just imagine being on a beachhead where 8,000 Marines die around you, and all you have is, you know, a piece of paper and a pen sketching it. That's got to be a frightening moment. And I think a lot about what Tom did and what makes Tom very, very important is his writings that we read and the themes that go through his books were a way of Tom writing himself out of what he saw on those beachheads, and the sinking of the Wasp and the sinking of the Hornet. It's him writing his way out of it. But at the same time, it happens at a very opportune time for him in Americans' history as well, because think of all the veterans that were trying to read themselves out of the horrors that they saw. And you know, you see this in The Brave Bulls, the danger of the horns. Mimi touched on it today. It is a war book. I mean, it's 100% a war book. It's hard to get past that. But the same thing, The Primal Yoke, which was Tom's favorite book, is about a war veteran coming home and him trying to coalesce the demons that he saw from overseas on the Pacific Rim and how he escaped from that. So this was all developing in Tom and Frank's early 1938-1941 relationship. So then from 1941 to 1957, you really get a shift in the narrative arc of the letters. It really starts to move where they're talking about home politics. Dobie is becoming much more politically active. Actually had a short stint of running for governor of Texas. Not very many people know this, but they discuss it back and forth. They discuss the Homer Rainey Institute and why Dobie ultimately left UT. And it's interesting as you read these, because most people that I've usually talked to think, you know, Tom's more liberal just because he's an artist than Dobie, where it's actually the opposite. Tom was a lot more conservative, but you see that in his works. I mean, he catches the conservative ethic. That's the part of what being an artist and a novelist is. You're conserving what you see around you and what you're writing about. And Frank wasn't that way. Frank lived in the past, and Frank just wanted to go back to how everything was, but then at the same time, he wanted to have progressive politics, which changed us and moved us to what we now have, the 21st century, where Tom never really discusses politics with him, which is always interesting. And I've had long conversations with Jim about this, because Frank would go off on these long diatribes about Coke Stevenson and Pappy Daniels and all these guys, just talking about their politics and trying to draw stuff out of Tom. But Tom was too savvy and wouldn't fall into Frank's rumor mongering and would just back away from it. So that's interesting. And then the last part of their relationship is from 1957 until 1964. And this is where the art of omission, but the art of maybe not omission, but of tweaking will serve me well. 1957, the King Ranch history is published. And it's published 5,000 copies through Little Brown, and it's published in a very small edition of 300 saddle blanket editions of the King Ranch. Obviously, it's a Southwest book. Who's going to be asked to review this for the New York Times? Frank Dobie is asked to review the book. Seems like it would be a natural, simpatico relationship. You know, Tom writes the book, Frank reviews it, gives him glowing reviews, the book sells, everybody's happy. That's actually not what happens. And it's interesting here, Frank was always known for being his own man. While he's writing the review for the New York Times, there's 6 letters from the editor of the New York Times Book Review asking Frank to rewrite sections that really say what Frank means. And it's interesting that Frank would never allow somebody to tell him to write, wouldn't even show anyone except for Bertha Dobie his writings, and she would basically edit them for him. He never showed Bertha the review, and she actually says this in a letter to Sarah, because Sarah and Bertha do all they can to get the 2 gentlemen back together after the fallout over the King Ranch. But the book review editor keeps telling Frank, this isn't enough, change it. So there's 7 drafts that have never seen the light of day that are going to go into the letters book, and that's going to make that 120,000 word thing very tight, because it's a 6,000 word review. But I want to show all 4 or 5 editions or drafts of the review to let people see it, because unfortunately the review as it stands and what was printed was enough to throw a schism between the 2 that they didn't talk again for another 3 years. There's a break in their correspondence for 3 years there because of what was said in this review. And what's interesting, and just being human, the night before the New York Times Book Review was going to come in, Frank was here in El Paso with Tom and Sarah celebrating the release of the book, knowing that this review was going to come out the next day, knowing what he said in this review, and knowing that it was going to hurt this relationship. There's a letter that's dated 3 days before this that he writes to Frank Wardlaw saying, I really regret what I put in this review. But he still put the review in, still came out to celebrate with Tom. When Tom got the letter, when Tom finally read the review, the things didn't go well. And basically from what I've heard from Jim, and you know, this is going behind closed door stuff, that Tom read the review, got very angry, and closed himself off in his office for a few days. And it took Herzog coming over trying to get him out. And since we do have an El Paso crowd here, I will ask you this, and you can tell me at the end. There's a gentleman that was an El Paso attorney named Webb Williams that wrote 5 or 6 letters to Frank and to Tom trying to get these guys back together. Jim doesn't know who Webb Williams is. I can't find where he studied. I can't find anything. So if anybody knows family members of Webb Williams, please let me know, because I really need to find this family to follow that track of how he fits into this. So Webb stops writing these letters in 1958, and Tom just basically says, I'm never going to talk to that SOB again. That's a quote from Jim that said he'll never talk to Frank again. As Webb Williams is writing these letters, and this gentleman, to find who he is so important, that Tom starts to open up to Webb, Frank starts to open up to Webb, but they're still not talking to each other, and they're going through here. And Tom's just like, I can't believe he came out here, drank my whiskey, ate my food, celebrated with us, knowing that this was coming out. Frank was just the opposite. Frank never apologized for anything. And he is just decrying to Frank Wardlaw, to Walter Prescott Webb, to Sarah, to anyone that will listen to him write a letter or read a letter that he writes, that I should have never published this review. I can't believe I did it. It actually says I shouldn't have listened to what the book review editor said. So it really starts to problematize this relationship, and they have no correspondence with each other, no talking with each other until 1961. Very important day happens in 1961. Jim Lee graduates from UT with his doctorate. Tom and Sarah go to Austin to go see him. What does Sarah do? Sarah and Bertha, Frank's wife, had a long-going correspondence during this 4 or 5 year period that these guys aren't talking. ladies get together, we got to get these guys talking again. We got to get these guys on the same page. So it was at the end of that trip to go see Jim graduate that Sarah finally gets Tom to go over to see Frank, and it's a 30-minute just, how are you doing? They walk in, and from what Jim says, he was there. There were hugs. Frank starts crying. Tom starts crying. They say they're sorry to each other, and then that's the end of it. But then what becomes interesting after that is there's another 6 months before they write to each other. But then all of a sudden, the correspondence from from about November 1961 until September 1964, when Frank passes away, there's almost a letter a week. And it's just where they start to get into this talking about what are we going to do with our letters, what should we do with these, and what have our lives been, what did we mean to each other. And it really moves beyond that Lon Tinkle paternalistic, to which I think is actually a stronger bond. It becomes more of a fraternalistic. They really start to talk like brothers and equals and trying to mend this relationship and get themselves back on track with each other. So it really makes it interesting for me. What is the legacy of these gentlemen, Tom and Frank? And it goes back, always goes back to Larry McMurtry's Ever a Bridegroom, because Frank Wardlaw coined the term the Texas Triumvirate in Frank's eulogy when Frank passed away. And since then, that has destroyed Texas letters, because now all of Texas letters have to be compared to Walter Prescott Webb, who was a historian, not a literati, to Roy Bedichek, which was a naturalist, and I use naturalist in the loosest sense of the term, and Frank Dobie, which wanted to write fiction but couldn't write fiction because he tried to catch the oral tales that he heard and put them on paper, and oral tradition doesn't usually pass down into the written word as well as one would like. So that has really made our Texas letters problematic in defining what a Texas literature is. So the legacy between these two, and what I hope these letters will do, will show the importance of including Lee as the center of Texas letters and Texas writing, because he's really one of the first Texas novelists before, George Sessions Perry was before that with Hold On 'Em in Your Hand. But he didn't really get into the meta-narrative discourse that Tom does in his characters and look at deeper, more problematic themes that Tom does. And that's, as Tom was writing all of his novels, he did write to Frank about what was going into these novels and what he was thinking as he was doing it. So I hope that this project, the Lee Dobie letters, will change Larry McMurtry's mind, number one, to include, not a Texas triumvirate, but a Texas quadriumvirate of including Tom Lee into this picture. But then also show that, those weren't the only three writers that defined Texas. There was Catherine Ann Porter, George Sessions Perry, R.J. Villette. There's a ton of folks that need to be included in this, but Tom was at the base of this, and unfortunately out here in El Paso, as I'm sure some of y'all know, you are a different time zone, you are very, 7 hours from civilization going east. So, that's part of why Tom is sometimes not thought of as a Texas writer, when he's a Texas writer, but he's also bigger than that. He's also a Southwestern writer. And if you look at the themes that he writes of war and trying to mend the broken hearts that Americans had after the war, Tom Lee is an American writer and should belong there. So thank you. And if you guys have any questions, I'd feel free to ask them.